If you Nausicaans want to keep calling humans primitive apes, then this ape will fuck your shit up in simulated combat to prove human superiority. And when I win, you slimy alien fucks are gonna start referring to me as a fucking god. Challenge accepted. Captain Dennis Wells spat the words at Kalar, the top Nausicaan student, as the Galactic Academy's lecture hall erupted into commotion. This was Wells's first week teaching advanced warfare tactics to the notoriously militant Nausicaans. He had expected resistance to human methods, but not outright disdain and disrespect. Kalar bared his fangs in a sneer, looming over the human. Bold claims for a member of such a weak species, human. I accept your challenge. Defeat me in the combat simulator, and perhaps you'll earn a shred of respect. When I inevitably crush you, you will leave the academy in disgrace. The Nausicaan students murmured excitedly, bloodlust glinting in their eyes. They were eager to see the arrogant human humiliated at the hands of their champion. Wells simply nodded, a grim smile on his face. He knew the stakes were high. This was his chance to prove humanity's worth and cement his standing at the academy. If he failed, it would be a devastating setback for human-Nausicaan relations. The tension in the room was palpable as both combatants strode to the holographic simulator, ready to wage virtual war. Kalar was smug and dismissive while Wells was cold and focused. With a crackle of energy, the cutting-edge simulator sprang to life, ready to test these commanders in the crucible of simulated battle. Pride, reputation, and the future of the academy hung in the balance as Captain Wells prepared to show the Nausicaans what humans were truly made of. In his heart, he knew he carried the hopes and honor of humanity on his shoulders. Failure was not an option. The holographic simulator crackled and hummed as Wells and Kalar materialized on the virtual battlefield, weapons at the ready. The Nausicaan students watched with held breath, eager to see their champion crush the upstart human. Wells and Kalar circled each other warily, sizing up their opponent. Kalar lunged first, his razor-sharp claws slashing through the air. Wells dodged nimbly, countering with a swift kick to Kalar's midsection. The Nausicaan grunted but barely flinched. "Is that all you've got, human?" Kalar taunted, baring his fangs in a vicious grin. Wells didn't reply, instead focusing on anticipating Kalar's next move. The Nausicaan attacked again, this time with a flurry of punches and kicks that drove Wells back. The human captain blocked and parried, looking for an opening. Kalar's superior strength and reach gave him an advantage, but Wells's speed and agility kept him in the fight. The two warriors traded blows, neither able to gain the upper hand. Sweat poured down Wells's face as he strained to match Kalar's relentless onslaught. Suddenly, Wells saw his chance. As Kalar overextended on a punch, Wells ducked under the Nausicaaan's arm and delivered a devastating uppercut to Kalar's jaw. The Nausicaan staggered back, momentarily stunned. Wells pressed his advantage, raining down a series of precise strikes to Kalar's vulnerable points. The Nausicaan tried to rally, but Wells's lightning-fast attacks overwhelmed him. With a final crushing blow to the temple, Kalar crumpled to the ground, unconscious. The simulator flickered and disappeared, leaving Wells standing over Kalar's prone form in the real world. The Nausicaan students stared in shocked silence for a moment, then erupted into raucous cheers. "The human has proven himself," one student shouted. "He has earned our respect." Wells helped Kalar to his feet, clasping the Nausicaan's forearm in a warrior's salute. Kalar, though bruised and battered, nodded in acknowledgement of Wells's victory. From that day forward, Wells' lessons were met with newfound enthusiasm and dedication from his Nausicaan students. They eagerly absorbed his teachings on strategy, tactics, and the art of war. However, not everyone was pleased with Wells' success. Commander Zolak, a traditional Nausicaan hardliner, viewed the humans' influence as a threat to their way of life. He began subtly undermining Wells' lessons, planting seeds of doubt among the other faculty members. Wells sensed the growing tension, but remained focused on his duties. In his spare time, he started discreetly investigating the academy's restricted areas, driven by a nagging suspicion that something was amiss. Late one night, Wells crept through the darkened halls of the Academy's research wing. Using his security clearance, he slipped into a hidden laboratory deep within the bowels of the building. What he found inside made his blood run cold. The lab was filled with advanced alien technology, far beyond anything the Nausicaans should have possessed. Blueprints and schematics for powerful new weapons littered the workbenches. Wells realized with growing horror that the Nausicaans were secretly developing an arsenal that could shift the balance of power in the galaxy. As Wells moved to take a closer look at the plans, the lights suddenly flared to life. Commander Zolak stood in the doorway, flanked by a group of armed Nausicaan guards. "Well, what do we have here?" Zolak sneered. "A spy and a traitor, caught red-handed." Before Wells could react, the guards surged forward, roughly grabbing him and wrenching his arms behind his back. "You've seen too much, human," Zolak growled. "Now you will pay the price for your meddling." The guards dragged Wells away to a detention cell deep within the Academy's security block. There, Zolak oversaw his brutal interrogation, demanding to know who Wells was working for and what he had learned about their secret project. Despite the searing pain of Zolak's torture, Wells refused to break. He insisted that he was no spy, just a concerned teacher trying to uncover the truth. Zolak scoffed at Wells' explanations, promising that the human would soon face execution for his crimes against the Nausicaan people. Unbeknownst to Wells, Kalar had witnessed his mentor's capture. The young Nausicaan warrior was torn, his loyalty to his people warring with the respect and admiration he felt for Wells. In the end, Kalar's sense of honor won out. He gathered a small group of loyal students, those who had come to believe in Wells' teachings, and hatched a plan to rescue their human teacher. Under the cover of night, Kalar and his team infiltrated the detention block. They swiftly overpowered the guards, their training under Wells giving them a crucial edge. Kalar himself blasted open the door to Wells' cell, freeing the badly beaten human. Together, Wells and the Nausicaan students fought their way out of the detention block. Alarms blared as they raced through the Academy's halls, desperate to reach the landing pad where a shuttle waited to aid their escape. Just as they neared their goal, Commander Zolak and a contingent of heavily armed guards emerged to block their path. Zolak's eyes blazed with fury as he leveled his weapon at Wells and Kalar. "Traitors, the lot of you!" Zolak roared. "You dishonor the Nausicaan race with your actions. Now you will die for your betrayal." Wells and Kalar exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. As one, they charged at Zolak, dodging and weaving through the hail of blaster fire. Zolak snarled, engaging them in a brutal hand-to-hand battle. The human and Nausicaan fought side by side, their contrasting styles blending into a seamless dance of destruction. Kalar's raw power and Wells' precise techniques overwhelmed Zolak, forcing him back. In a last bold strategy, Zolak lunged for a control panel on the wall. His claws stabbed down on a large red button, even as Wells and Kalar's final blows sent him crashing to the ground. "If I cannot have victory," Zolak hissed, blood bubbling from his lips, "then none of you will." A klaxon began to blare, warning of the hidden lab's imminent self-destruction. Wells, Kalar, and the students sprinted for the shuttle, piling aboard just as the first explosions ripped through the Academy's foundation. The shuttle rocketed away from the crumbling Academy, the shockwaves buffeting the small craft. Wells and Kalar watched grimly as the secret weapons lab detonated in a massive fireball, consuming all evidence of the Nausicaans' clandestine project. In the aftermath of the destruction, the truth of the conspiracy began to spread among the surviving Nausicaan students. Wells and Kalar were hailed as heroes, their bravery in exposing the dangerous plot winning them the admiration and loyalty of the younger generation. But even as they basked in the adulation of the students, Wells and Kalar knew their fight was far from finished. The Nausicaan military, enraged by the loss of their secret weapons program, had branded them as fugitives and traitors. They would be hunted relentlessly, forced to stay one step ahead of their pursuers. As the shuttle streaked through the stars, carrying them toward an uncertain future, Wells and Kalar faced a momentous decision. They could attempt to expose the Nausicaan conspiracy to the wider galactic community, risking all-out war, or use their knowledge to broker a tenuous peace deal between the fractious factions of Nausicaan society. The fate of humanity and all alien species hung in the balance as the unlikely allies pondered their next move, the weight of their choices bearing down upon them. For Wells and Kalar, the path ahead was fraught with danger and uncertainty, but they knew one thing for sure. They would face it together, united by the bond of battle and the shared dream of a better tomorrow. The stolen Nausicaan ship lurched through space, its engines straining as Wells pushed them to their limits. In the cockpit, tension crackled between the human and his Nausicaan ally. "We need to tell everyone," Wells insisted, his fingers flying over the controls. "The whole galaxy needs to know what your people were planning." Kalar's face twisted into a scowl. "And start an interstellar war. Use your head, human. We can leverage this information. Force a truce." Before Wells could retort, alarms blared. A massive Nausicaan warship dropped out of warp, its weapons trained on their tiny vessel. "Fugitives, power down and prepare to be boarded," a gruff voice demanded over the comms. Wells locked eyes with Kalar, a wild plan forming. "Trust me," he said, then opened a broadcast channel. "This is Captain Dennis Wells. We have evidence of your secret weapons program. Stand down, or I'll transmit it to every major power in the quadrant." Silence stretched for agonizing seconds. Then, miraculously, the warship's weapons powered down. "By the void," Kalar breathed. "It worked." A coded transmission pinged their console. Chancellor Vorzak himself requested their presence for peace talks at a neutral location. Days later, Wells and Kalar docked at a nondescript space station. They were met by Vorzak and a cadre of high-ranking Nausicaans, their expressions unreadable. In a stark conference room, Wells laid out his proposal. "Dismantle the weapons program, submit to inspections. In exchange, I'll share human tactical knowledge to boost your defenses." Outraged voices filled the room. "Preposterous!" one hardliner shouted. "We'd be crippling ourselves." Kalar stood, silencing the room. "Listen to him," he urged. "Cooperation with humanity is our future. Our survival depends on it." The negotiations stretched on, progress achingly slow. Just as a breakthrough seemed imminent, the station rocked violently. "We're under attack!" a security officer shouted. "Extremists!" Wells and Kalar sprang into action, organizing the station's defenders. They fought side by side, human and Nausicaan, repelling waves of attackers. In the chaos, Wells spotted a grenade arcing towards Chancellor Vorzak. Without hesitation, he tackled the Nausicaan leader, shielding him from the blast. As the smoke cleared, Vorzak stared at Wells in awe. "You saved me," he said, his voice thick with disbelief. With that selfless act, the tide turned. Vorzak silenced the remaining opposition, agreeing to Wells' terms. In the days that followed, Wells and Kalar found themselves hailed as heroes across Nausicaan space. The Academy welcomed Wells back with open arms, eager for his instruction. News of the alliance spread like wildfire. Some worlds celebrated, while others eyed the development warily. For Wells and Kalar, the real work was just beginning. They had forged an unlikely partnership, but greater challenges lay ahead. The galaxy was changing, and they stood at the heart of that change. The halls of the Galactic Academy buzzed with excitement as Dennis Wells strode through them. Students and faculty alike stopped to stare, whispering in awe as the human who brokered peace with the Nausicaans passed by. Wells nodded politely, but his mind was elsewhere, focused on the task ahead. As he entered the lecture hall, a sea of Nausicaan faces turned to watch him. Wells took his place at the podium, preparing to begin his class on interspecies diplomacy. But before he could speak, a group of students in the back row stood up. "Human filth!" one of them shouted. "You have no place here!" The group unfurled a banner bearing the symbol of the true Nausicaan front. They began chanting, drowning out Wells' attempts to restore order. Security guards rushed in, dragging the protesters out as they continued to hurl insults. Wells sighed, running a hand through his hair. This wasn't the first disruption, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. The true front, led by the charismatic Commander Gralek, had been gaining traction among the more conservative elements of Nausicaan society. Later that evening, Wells met with Kalar in a secluded corner of the Academy grounds. The young Nausicaaan's eyes darted nervously, checking for eavesdroppers. "It's worse than we thought," Kalar whispered. "Gralek's not just spreading propaganda. He's arming his followers." Wells' eyes widened. "Are you sure?" Kalar nodded grimly. "I overheard some of my old classmates talking. They're stockpiling weapons, planning to overthrow Vorzak's government." Wells clenched his fists. They couldn't let this happen. Not after everything they'd sacrificed for peace. Under cover of darkness, Wells and Kalar slipped out of the academy, following the trail of breadcrumbs Kalar had uncovered. They found themselves at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Peering through a grimy window, they saw stacks of crates filled with energy weapons. Gralek himself stood in the center, addressing a group of armed Nausicaans. "We must strike now," Gralek's voice carried through the thin walls, "before the human poison spreads further." Wells turned to Kalar. "We need to get evidence. Alert the authorities." But as they moved to enter the warehouse, a shout rang out. "Intruders!" Blaster fire erupted around them. Wells and Kalar dove for cover, returning fire as they retreated. They found themselves surrounded, facing off against Kalar's former classmates. The battle was fierce, neither side willing to give ground. Wells and Kalar fought back to back, their movements in perfect sync. Suddenly, Gralek's voice cut through the chaos. "Enough!" Wells looked up to see Gralek holding Kalar in a chokehold, a blaster pressed to his head. "Surrender now, human!" Gralek snarled, "or watch your pet Nausicaan die!" Wells hesitated, his mind racing. He couldn't let Kalar die, but surrendering meant doom for the peace they'd worked so hard to achieve. "Don't do it, Wells!" Kalar gasped. The standoff stretched on, neither side willing to back down. Just as Wells thought all hope was lost, the sound of approaching ships filled the air. Chancellor Vorzak's voice boomed over a loudspeaker. "This is the Nausicaan Security Force. Lay down your weapons and surrender." Gralek's eyes widened in panic. He shoved Kalar aside and made a break for it. Wells gave chase, tackling Gralek to the ground. They grappled fiercely, trading blows as Vorzak's forces swarmed the area. In the end, Wells stood victorious, Gralek in cuffs at his feet. The true Nausicaan front's plans lay in ruins. In the days that followed, Wells found himself once again hailed as a hero. But as he stood before a cheering crowd, he felt hollow inside. The hatred in Gralek's eyes haunted him, reminding him of his own past. Kalar approached, placing a hand on Wells's shoulder. "What now?" he asked. Wells took a deep breath. "Now we build something better, together." As they walked away from the crowd, Wells knew their work was just getting started, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hope for the future. The galaxy buzzed with news of the thwarted True Nausicaan Front conspiracy. Across countless worlds, beings of all species debated the implications. On Rigel 7, a Tellarite merchant raised his mug in a crowded spaceport bar. "To humans and Nausicaans working together, who'd have thought?" But not all reactions were positive. In the shadows of power, the hegemonic sovereignty seethed. High Admiral Zhou Khan of the Tholian Assembly pounded his crystalline fist on the war room table. "This alliance threatens everything we've built. We must act." At the Galactic Academy, Wells stood before a class of mixed human and Nausicaan cadets. "Today, we'll practice joint tactical maneuvers," he announced, activating a holographic battle simulation. As the cadets worked through the exercise, Wells noticed Branton, a promising human officer, whispering to a group of Nausicaans. His eyes narrowed. Something felt off. Later that night, Wells and Kalar pored over security logs in a dimly lit office. "Look at this," Kalar growled, pointing to a data stream. "Encrypted transmissions from inside the Academy to known sovereignty outposts." Wells' blood ran cold. "We've been infiltrated." The next day, as Wells prepared for another training session, the Academy's alarms blared. Armed Nausicaan security forces burst into the classroom. "Dennis Wells, you're under arrest for weapons trafficking." Wells raised his hand slowly. There must be some mistake. A deafening boom shook the building. Plasma bolts sizzled through the air. Cadets screamed and dove for cover as security forces and Wells supporters exchanged fire. In the chaos, Wells spotted Branton slipping away, a satisfied smirk on his face. Everything clicked into place. "It's a setup!" Wells shouted, ducking behind an overturned desk. The firefight raged on. Stray shots shattered windows and scorched walls. A young Nausicaan cadet cried out in pain, clutching a wounded arm. Chancellor Vorzak's voice boomed over the Academy's comm system. "Cease fire immediately. We have evidence of Branton's betrayal. Wells and Kalar are innocent." The shooting stopped. In the smoky aftermath, Wells helped the injured cadet to his feet. Bodies of both humans and Nausicaans littered the floor. The cost of this deception was already too high. Vorzak wasted no time. "Expel all sovereignty-sympathizing students," he ordered, "and put our territories on high alert. This isn't over." He was right. Within days, reports flooded in of Branton leading sovereignty-backed forces in surprise attacks on Nausicaan colonies. Vorzak's loyalists fought valiantly, but were overwhelmed by superior numbers and weaponry. Wells and Kalar knew they had to act. Under cover of darkness, they snuck into a high-security hangar. Before them stood the prototype Nausicaan warship, the NX-1, its sleek lines promising unmatched speed and firepower. "Sure you want to do this?" Kalar asked as they climbed aboard. Wells nodded grimly. "We don't have a choice." The stolen ship screamed out of the hangar, leaving stunned guards in its wake. Their mission: to cut off the sovereignty supply lines and give the Alliance a fighting chance. For weeks, they harried sovereignty convoys, using the NX-1's advanced cloaking technology to strike and vanish. After a particularly daring raid, Wells noticed a pattern in the convoy's flight path. "They're all converging here," he said, pointing to an unmarked frozen moon. "It must be their staging area." A small strike team assembled in the NX-1's hold. Wells briefed them on the assault plan as they approached the icy world. Massive glaciers and crystalline formations loomed below. As they touched down, Branton's personal guard swarmed out of hidden bunkers. The battle erupted across the frozen landscape. Blaster fire melted ice into steam, obscuring visibility. Wells lost sight of Kalar in the melee. Suddenly, Branton's voice rang out over a loudspeaker. "Surrender, Wells! We have your Nausicaan friend!" Heart pounding, Wells realized he was on his own. He had to get into that fortified compound and save Kalar. The fate of two worlds rested on his shoulders as he crept towards the enemy stronghold, ready to risk everything for the alliance he'd helped forge. Wells crept through the dimly lit corridors of the Sovereignty outpost, his heart pounding in his ears. The stench of ozone and stale air filled his nostrils as he navigated the maze-like structure. He paused at an intersection, consulting a stolen data pad. Kalar's cell was close. Reaching a maintenance panel, Wells pried it open and began rerouting power conduits. His fingers flew over the controls, overloading circuits with practiced efficiency. Alarms blared as sections of the facility plunged into darkness. In the ensuing chaos, Wells sprinted to the detention block. Guards shouted in confusion as emergency lighting bathed the area in an eerie red glow. He found Kalar slumped in a cell, bruised but alive. "Took you long enough?" Kalar grunted as Wells deactivated the force field. "You're welcome," Wells replied, tossing Kalar a blaster. "Now let's move." They fought their way through the compound, ducking behind cover as energy bolts sizzled past. Wells' human reflexes complemented Kalar's Nausicaan strength as they systematically neutralized security forces. Reaching the hangar bay, they commandeered a sleek shuttle. Wells' fingers danced over the unfamiliar controls as Kalar laid down covering fire. The craft roared to life, blasting out of the bay as alarms wailed behind them. Outside, space erupted into chaos. Wells' strike team swarmed around their shuttle, engaging sovereignty fighters in a furious dogfight. Explosions bloomed silently in the void as ships on both sides were torn apart. "We're outnumbered," Kalar shouted over the comm. "We can't win this." Wells gritted his teeth, scanning tactical readouts. "We're not trying to win. We're trying to survive." He punched in a new vector, aiming for the frozen moon below. "All units, follow my lead. We're going in hot." The shuttle plunged into the moon's turbulent upper atmosphere, trailing fire as it cut through swirling clouds of ice crystals. G-forces slammed Wells and Kalar into their seats as they struggled to maintain control. With a bone-jarring impact, the crippled craft skidded across a barren ice field. As the shuttle ground to a halt, Wells saw sovereignty ships descending through gaps in the storm-racked sky. "Everyone out," he ordered. "Grab what you can carry. We're moving on foot." The ragtag group stumbled out into a howling blizzard. Icy wind cut through their thermal gear as they trudged across the desolate landscape. Wells consulted his nav computer, plotting a course to a distant Alliance safe zone. Days blurred together as they battled the elements. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Massive predators with slavering jaws stalked them through blinding snowstorms. Twice, they narrowly escaped sovereignty hunter-killer teams. During one frantic firefight, a sovereignty raider's energy blast caught Kalar in the chest. The Nausicaan collapsed, blood staining the pristine snow. Wells dragged his friend to safety, frantically applying Medigel to the wound. "Don't you dare die on me," he growled. Kellar's eyes fluttered open. "Wouldn't dream of it," he wheezed. With iron will, Wells hoisted Kalar onto his back. Step by agonizing step, he pressed on through waist-deep snowdrifts. The cold sapped his strength, but he refused to leave his friend behind. Some of the strike team fell to the relentless conditions, their bodies swallowed by the endless white. Those who remained formed a protective circle around Wells and Kalar, fending off threats from all sides. After what felt like an eternity, they crested a final ridge. In the valley below, an Alliance stealth frigate shimmered into view, its cloaking field dispersing. "We made it," Wells gasped, his legs finally giving out as medical teams rushed to meet them. Aboard the ship, Kalar awoke in the medbay to find Wells slumped in a chair beside him, fast asleep. The Nausicaa's normally stern features softened. "I've never seen anything like it," Kalar said quietly when Wells stirred. "You carried me for days. How?" Wells shrugged, wincing at sore muscles. "Couldn't let you die out there. We started this together. We'll finish it together." As they recovered, news of their ordeal spread like wildfire. Nausicaan cadets whispered of Wells's legendary endurance. Humans marveled at his iron will. Across Alliance space, a resistance movement bloomed. In a crowded war room, Wells stood before a holomap displaying sovereignty-controlled systems. Alliance commanders argued strategy, their voices rising. "We can't risk Wells on the front lines," one insisted. "He's too valuable as a symbol." Wells pounded his fist on the table. "I'm not a symbol," he growled. "I'm a soldier, and I'll be damned if I send others to die while I sit back in safety." He turned to address the room. "The sovereignty thinks they can break us. They're wrong. We'll hit them where it hurts, and we'll keep hitting them until this war is won. Who's with me?" A cheer went up from the assembled officers. As they dispersed to prepare for battle, Kalar approached Wells. "Ready for another adventure?" the Nausicaan asked, a rare smile on his face. Wells nodded, his eyes fixed on the stars beyond the viewport. "Always." Wells stood before the Alliance War Council, his expression resolute as he listened to the cautious commanders debate strategy. The room buzzed with tension, voices rising and falling as they argued over the next move against the sovereignty. "We can't risk our most valuable asset on the front lines," Admiral Thrix insisted, gesturing towards Wells. "He's too important to the cause." Wells stepped forward, his eyes blazing. "With all due respect, Admiral, I didn't come this far to sit on the sidelines." Chancellor Vorzak raised a hand, silencing the room. "Perhaps a compromise. Wells, we need your tactical expertise now more than ever. What if you led from behind the lines?" After a long pause, Wells nodded. I'll step back from direct combat, but I won't be sidelined entirely. Give me the resources and I'll hit the sovereignty where it hurts most. In the days that followed, Wells and Keelar worked tirelessly, converting an abandoned mining outpost into a covert base of operations. They pored over personnel files, selecting the best and brightest from both human and Nausicaan ranks. Shadow Vanguard, Wells announced to the assembled elite operatives. That's what they'll call us. We strike from the darkness, unseen and unheard. Their first target, a sovereignty logistical hub buried deep within an asteroid. Wells hunched over a holographic display, outlining the infiltration plan to his team. We go in as civilian contractors, he explained, highlighting key entry points. Once inside, we make our way to the central command bunker. Keelar grunted in approval. And then we bring it all crashing down. The civilian freighter shuddered as it docked with the asteroid. Wells, disguised as a grizzled deckhand, kept his head down as he followed the flow of workers into the facility. His eyes darted from side to side, cataloging security checkpoints and patrol patterns. Hours later, Wells crouched in a maintenance tunnel, sweat beading on his forehead as he waited for the precise moment to strike. His earpiece crackled to life. Shield generators cycling in 3, 2, 1. Wells burst into action, sprinting down the corridor towards the control room. He rounded a corner, coming face to face with a startled sovereignty guard. Without hesitation, Wells lashed out, his fist connecting with the guard's temple. The man crumpled to the floor. Alarms blared as Wells's team seized control of vital systems. The bunker erupted into chaos, security forces pouring in from all directions. Plasma bolts sizzled through the air as Keelar and his Nausicaan strike team engaged the enemy. Wells, we're pinned down! Keelar's voice roared over the comm. We need that data now! Ducking and weaving through the crossfire, Wells made his way to the data vault. His fingers flew over the console, initiating the download of the munitions convoy schedules. Each second felt like an eternity as the progress bar inched forward. Download complete, Wells announced, transmitting the data to waiting Alliance ships. Keelar, time to go. They fought their way back through the facility, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. As they boarded their extraction shuttle, Wells took one last look at the chaos they'd unleashed. The sovereignty's carefully laid plans were unraveling before his eyes. In the weeks that followed, reports flooded in of Alliance victories across Nausicaan space. Branton's forces, cut off from supplies and reinforcements, crumbled under the onslaught. Wells stood before a massive holodisplay, watching as yet another sovereignty stronghold fell to Alliance forces. Keelar approached, clapping a hand on his shoulder. Not bad for a human who's supposed to be behind the lines, the Nausicaan rumbled. Wells allowed himself a small smile. We're not done yet. Branton's still out there. But even as he spoke, reports came in of Branton's capture. The traitor had finally run out of options, surrendering to an Alliance patrol after months on the run. News of Shadow Vanguard's exploits spread like wildfire. In bars and mess halls across Alliance space, soldiers swapped stories of the daring raid that had turned the tide of war. Chancellor Vorzak stood on a raised platform, addressing a sea of cheering humans and Nausicaans. Today, we honor the man who made this victory possible. Dennis Wells, step forward. Wells ascended the steps, his face impassive as Vorzak draped a gleaming medal around his neck. From this day forward, Vorzak proclaimed, you shall be known as the living Aegis, protector of our alliance and scourge of our enemies. The crowd roared its approval. As Wells gazed out over the sea of faces, he caught Keelar's eye in the crowd. The Nausicaan nodded, a ghost of a smile on his face. Wells raised a hand, quieting the crowd. This victory belongs to all of us, he said, his voice carrying across the plaza. Human and Nausicaan, soldier and civilian, together we've shown the galaxy what we're capable of, and we're just getting started. As the cheers washed over him, Wells allowed himself a moment of pride. But even as he basked in the glow of victory, his mind was already turning to the challenges that lay ahead. Wells stood before the viewport, his face a mask of stoic concentration as he watched Allied ships engage sovereignty forces. The battle raged silently in the void of space, punctuated by brilliant flashes as energy weapons found their marks. Kalar approached, his heavy footsteps echoing on the deck plating. "Another victory," the Nausicaan rumbled, a note of satisfaction in his gravelly voice. Wells nodded, but his brow furrowed. Yes, but at what cost? In the weeks that followed, reports trickled in of rogue factions taking matters into their own hands. Wells pored over intelligence briefs, his stomach churning as he read accounts of unauthorized strikes and civilian casualties. "They're using our tactics," he muttered, tossing a datapad onto the cluttered war table. "But without the precision, without the intel, it's a disaster waiting to happen." As if to punctuate his words, an urgent transmission cut through the air. A panicked voice crackled over the comm system. "This is Governor Trowell of Nebulon III. We're under attack by Nausicaan forces claiming to be allies of the living Aegis. They're targeting civilian centers. Please, we need immediate assistance." Wells' blood ran cold. He locked eyes with Kalar, who nodded grimly. "The iconoclasts," the Nausicaan growled. "We need to move. Now." They raced to the hangar bay, boarding a stealth shuttle with a hand-picked team. As they rocketed towards Nebulon III, Wells' mind raced. How had it come to this? His actions, meant to inspire hope, had instead sparked a wave of misguided zealotry. The shuttle broke atmosphere, revealing a hellscape below. Fires raged across the colony's main settlement, and the air was thick with smoke and the screams of the wounded. Wells gritted his teeth as he saw Nausicaan warriors indiscriminately firing into crowds of fleeing civilians. "This ends now," he snarled, activating his comm. "All iconoclast forces, this is Dennis Wells. Stand down immediately." For a moment, the carnage paused. Then a voice, filled with awe and fanaticism, responded. "The living Aegis himself. We fight in your name to purge the galaxy of sovereignty influence." "You're killing innocent people," Wells shouted, his voice cracking with fury. "This isn't what we stand for." But his words fell on deaf ears. The slaughter resumed, and Wells knew there was only one option left. He turned to his team, his expression grim. "Take them down. Non-lethal if possible, but protect the civilians at all costs." The next hours were a blur of close-quarters combat and frantic evacuations. Wells moved through the chaos like a ghost, disarming fanatics and shielding terrified colonists. By the time it was over, the settlement lay in ruins, and the toll of the dead and wounded was staggering. As the dust settled, Wells stood amidst the devastation, his shoulders slumped with the weight of responsibility. A crowd of survivors gathered, their eyes filled with a mix of fear, awe, and accusation. "This can't happen again," Wells said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. He turned to Kalar, his voice low and resolute. "We need to disappear. All of us. Shadow Vanguard, the living Aegis. It all needs to go dark." In the days that followed, carefully crafted reports of Wells' death on a secret mission spread through Alliance channels. To the galaxy at large, the legendary human hero had fallen in battle, his legacy secure. But for Wells, a new mission was just beginning. Disguised as a nondescript human recruit, he stood at attention in a line of fresh-faced sovereignty soldiers. His new identity, Corsair, was unremarkable in every way, except for the fire that burned behind his eyes. As a cruel-faced drill instructor paced before them, barking orders and spouting sovereignty propaganda, Wells steeled himself for what was to come. He would endure, he would infiltrate, and he would find a way to bring down the sovereignty from within, whatever it takes to his own soul. Wells' eyes widened as the truth about Archon Prime crashed over him like a tidal wave. His stomach churned as he realized the implications. He had to warn the Alliance, and fast. Ducking into an empty corridor, Wells tapped furiously at his wrist communicator, trying to establish a secure channel. Static crackled, then silence. His heart pounded as footsteps echoed nearby. "Corsair, report to command immediately." Wells sprinted down the hallway, searching for an escape route. Alarms blared, red lights flashing. He rounded a corner and slammed into a squad of elite sovereignty troops. There he is. Plasma bolts sizzled past his head as Wells dove for cover. He returned fire, downing 2 soldiers before his weapon overheated. As he prepared to make a final stand, a familiar voice cut through the chaos. "Hello, old friend." Branton emerged from the smoke, a cruel smile twisting his features. Before Wells could react, a stun baton struck him from behind. The world went dark. He awoke in a stark interrogation chamber, wrists and ankles bound to a cold metal chair. Days blurred together as Branton's men worked him over, demanding intel on Shadow Vanguard and Alliance defenses. Wells's body ached, but his commitment never wavered. "You're wasting your time," he spat, blood trickling from his split lip. Branton leaned in close, his breath hot on Wells's face. "Oh, I don't think so. Your execution is scheduled for tomorrow. A grand spectacle to crush any lingering resistance." As Wells was shoved back into his cell that night, a faint beeping caught his attention. He froze, listening intently. It was a coded message, tapped out in an old Alliance cipher. His heart leapt as he deciphered its meaning. Keelar was here, preparing a rescue. The next morning, Wells was marched towards the main hangar, flanked by heavily armed guards. His eyes darted around, searching for any sign of Keelar or his team. As they approached the massive bay doors, chaos erupted. Plasma fire erupted from multiple directions as Keelar's Nausicaans struck. Wells dropped to the ground, rolling away from his surprised captors. He snatched a fallen weapon and joined the fray, years of combat instincts kicking in. The hangar devolved into a 3-way firefight as rival sovereignty factions turned on each other, old grievances bubbling to the surface amidst the confusion. Wells fought his way through the melee, searching for Branton. A hand grabbed his shoulder, yanking him backwards. Wells spun, coming face to face with his nemesis. Branton sneered, dragging Wells towards a waiting shuttle. "You're my ticket out of here," Branton growled. Wells planted his feet, then drove his elbow into Branton's solar plexus. As the man doubled over, Wells struck again, a vicious uppercut that sent Branton reeling. The 2 men grappled, trading blows in a furious close-quarters brawl. A familiar roar cut through the din of battle. Keelar charged forward, his massive frame bowling over several sovereignty troops. Together, Wells and his old friend pressed the attack against Branton. Cornered and bleeding, Branton's hand moved to his chest, a maniacal glint in his eyes. Wells' instincts screamed danger. He lunged forward, tackling Branton to the ground just as the man's fingers found a hidden switch. A muffled click, then nothing. "Bio-explosive," Branton wheezed, "enough toxins to poison half the ship." Wells' fist connected with Branton's jaw, knocking him unconscious. He turned to Keelar, who was already securing their prisoner. "We need to get to the bridge," Wells shouted over the continuing firefight. "End this once and for all." They fought their way through burning corridors, the ship shuddering under the strain of battle. On the bridge, Wells shoved aside the corpse of a sovereignty officer and accessed the main computer. His fingers flew across the console as he uploaded the worm, designed to obliterate every trace of the Archon Prime conspiracy. As the program did its work, Wells keyed in a ship-wide broadcast. "People of the Sovereignty," he began, his voice carrying across every frequency. "You've been lied to. The Archon Prime you serve is a fraud, a puppet of—" The cheers of victory faded, replaced by an uneasy silence. Wells stood at the viewport of the Alliance flagship, his eyes fixed on the stars beyond. The weight of recent events pressed down on him, suffocating the joy he should have felt. Keelar's heavy footsteps approached. The Nausicaan's voice was low, gravelly. "You feel it too, don't you?" Wells nodded, not turning. "Branton's still out there. This isn't over." "He won't stop," Keelar growled. "Not until one of you is dead." Before Wells could respond, alarms blared throughout the ship. A frantic voice crackled over the comms. "Multiple attacks reported across Allied space, sovereignty remnants calling themselves the Iconoclast Ascendancy." Wells' fists clenched. "Branton!" The next weeks were a blur of firefights and narrow escapes. Wells and Keelar raced from world to world, always one step behind Branton's forces. They arrived on Nebulon IV to find a colony in flames, smoke rising from the rubble of government buildings. As they helped evacuate survivors, Wells's comm chirped, "This is Admiral Thax. We've lost contact with Detention Center Sigma. All prisoners unaccounted for." Wells' blood ran cold. "Including Grellick?" "Confirmed. Grellick is in the wind." Keelar snarled, a sound of pure rage. "We need to get to Korea Prime, now!" They arrived at the newly built capital to find it a hive of activity. Diplomats and military leaders from across the alliance gathered for a unity summit. Wells couldn't shake the feeling of impending disaster. As Chancellor Vorzak took the stage to address the assembled dignitaries, the floor exploded. Smoke filled the air as Branton's forces poured from hidden tunnels. Wells dove for cover, plasma bolts sizzling past his head. "Keelar!" he shouted, searching for his friend in the chaos. A massive explosion rocked the building, and Wells found himself cut off from the main security force. He fought his way through burning corridors, the screams of the wounded echoing in his ears. A group of terrified diplomats huddled behind an overturned table. Wells spotted Chancellor Vorzak among them, clutching a bleeding arm. "This way!" Wells shouted, leading them towards an emergency exit. They had almost reached safety when a familiar figure stepped from the shadows. Grellick, the Nautican's eyes gleaming with malice. "Going somewhere, Wells?" Wells shoved the diplomats behind him, raising his weapon. "Get them out of here!" he growled to a nearby security officer. "I'll handle this." Grellick lunged, a vibro blade humming to life in his hand. Wells ducked, feeling the weapon slice through the air where his head had been. They traded blows in the confined space, neither gaining the upper hand. A thunderous roar filled the corridor. Keelar burst through a wall of flames, tackling Grellick to the ground. "Go!" he shouted to Wells. "Get the Chancellor to safety. I'll finish this." Wells hesitated for a split second, then nodded. He raced after the evacuees, hearing the sounds of brutal combat behind him. Days stretched into a week as Allied forces fought to retake the capital. Wells led strike teams through ruined streets, methodically clearing buildings of iconoclast holdouts. The stench of smoke and death hung heavy in the air. Finally, they reached the central command bunker. Wells advanced alone, his boots echoing on metal grates. He found Branton in the reactor core, fingers dancing over a control panel. "It ends here, Dennis," Branton said, not turning. "One way or another." Wells raised his weapon, but Branton spun, tossing aside his gauntlets. In his hands gleamed two curved blades, ancient symbols etched into the metal. "The path of the immortal warrior," Branton intoned. "Our final duel, as it was always meant to be." Warning klaxons blared as the reactor core began to pulse with ominous energy. Wells knew he had no choice. He dropped his gun, accepting one of the ritual blades. "Let's finish this," he growled. They circled each other, eyes locked. The hum of the reactor grew louder, the chamber bathed in an eerie red glow. With a primal scream, Branton attacked. Metal rang against metal as their blades met. Wells felt the sting of a cut across his ribs, but he pressed on, driven by the knowledge that failure meant the death of millions. They fought with savage intensity, each slash and parry a testament to years of combat experience. Blood slicked the floor beneath their feet as they pushed their bodies to the limit. A massive door began to descend, sealing the chamber. Wells knew there would be no escape. This was their tomb, one way or another. Branton's eyes gleamed with madness as he pressed his attack. "For glory!" he shouted. "For immortality!" Wells said nothing, conserving his breath. He blocked, dodged, and struck with precision. The reactor's whine reached a fever pitch as the final seconds ticked away. Their blades locked, faces inches apart. Wells stared into the eyes of his nemesis, seeing the twisted reflection of what he might have become. With a final surge of strength, he...
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel. And for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.